The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel ballroom cast golden light across Manhattan's elite as they gathered for the annual Christmas charity auction. 2 million viewers watched the live stream, expecting another night of billionaire Billy Richardson's entertaining commentary. The camera captured everything: designer gowns, champagne flutes, and the centerpiece, a 1923 Stradivarius violin worth $3 million. Then she appeared in frame. Margaret Thompson, 58 years old, her weathered hands trembling as she reached toward the instrument's gleaming surface. The serving woman with calloused fingers and a stained uniform didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege. Billy's voice cut through the silence, speaking in rapid Japanese to his wealthy friends, his words dripping with contempt for the servant who dared touch perfection. The audience laughed. The donations poured in. The internet exploded with cruel memes. What happened next would break the internet and a billionaire's heart forever. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret Thompson had once commanded standing ovations at Carnegie Hall, 27 years ago. Her fingers had danced across violin strings with the precision of a master craftsman, earning her the title of Juilliard's most promising graduate. Tonight, those same hands, now rough from years of cleaning offices, serving tables, and scrubbing floors, clutched a silver serving tray as she navigated through Manhattan's wealthiest elite. At 58, Maggie carried herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. The black uniform marked her as invisible to most guests, just another face in the army of service workers who made these glittering events possible. What they couldn't see was the Harvard MBA hidden beneath her humble exterior, or the sleepless nights spent researching experimental treatments for her 12-year-old grandson Tommy's leukemia. Her husband Robert had died serving his country in Iraq, leaving her to raise their autistic son alone. When that son grew up and had Tommy, then died in a car accident, Maggie stepped in again. 3 generations of heartbreak had taught her that survival meant sacrifice, and tonight's catering job would cover another week of Tommy's medications. Across the ballroom, William Richardson commanded attention without trying. At 35, the tech mogul's empire stretched across social media platforms that connected billions of people, an irony lost on a man who had never learned to truly connect with anyone himself. Billy's adoption story played well for his public image, the orphaned foster child who built a fortune through determination and innovation. What the business magazines didn't report was the emptiness behind his success. James and Patricia Richardson had given him wealth, education, and opportunity, but love had always felt conditional, earned through achievements rather than freely given. This drove his relentless pursuit of validation through followers, likes, and viral moments that proved his worth to the world. Sarah Mitchell, the event organizer and Maggie's closest friend, watched nervously from the auction podium. She had insisted on hiring Maggie for tonight's event, knowing her friend needed the income. Dr. Emily Chen from Mount Sinai's Pediatric Oncology Ward sat at table 12, unaware that the woman serving her wine was funding her research through Tommy's treatment costs. As the evening progressed toward the violin auction, these separate worlds, wealth and poverty, past brilliance and present struggle, moved on a collision course that would shatter carefully constructed facades and reveal truths that some had spent decades hiding. Billy Richardson adjusted his phone's camera angle, ensuring his followers could capture both his perfectly styled appearance and the opulent ballroom behind him. The live stream numbers climbed steadily: 1.8 million, 1.9 million, 2 million viewers hanging on his every word as he provided his signature commentary on high society's latest gathering. Welcome back to another evening with Manhattan's finest. Billy's voice carried the practiced charm that had built his media empire. Tonight we're witnessing $3 million worth of violin about to change hands. The question is, does anyone here actually appreciate classical music? Or are we just buying expensive decoration? The chat exploded with donations and laughing emojis as his followers reveled in his insider's perspective on the wealthy elite. Billy had mastered the art of positioning himself as both insider and outsider, wealthy enough to belong, irreverent enough to mock the very world that had adopted him. The auctioneer called for a brief intermission before presenting the evening's crown jewel, the 1923 Stradivarius violin that had once belonged to a European virtuoso. as guests mingled and examined the instrument under its protective glass case. Billy continued his commentary, pointing his camera at various attendees and offering sardonic observations about their fashion choices and social pretensions. That's when he spotted her. Margaret Thompson stood transfixed before the violin display, her serving tray forgotten in her hands. Her weathered fingers trembled as she leaned closer to the glass, studying the instrument with an intensity that seemed out of place for a woman in a service uniform. The contrast was striking, and to Billy's entrepreneurial mind, perfect content for his audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Billy whispered into his phone, zooming the camera toward Maggie, "we have a situation developing. It appears one of tonight's serving staff has become captivated by fine art." The viewer count spiked as Billy approached Maggie, his phone broadcasting every step to millions of followers worldwide. Comments flooded the screen. "This is going to be good. Classic Billy content. Get her reaction." Billy switched to Japanese, knowing that most of his American audience wouldn't understand, but that his wealthy international followers would appreciate the exclusivity. His voice carried clearly across the marble floor as he gestured toward Maggie, his tone dripping with theatrical disdain. "Meet kudasai, Mina-san," he said, his words flowing smoothly as he addressed his Japanese viewers and the handful of international guests who turned to listen. "Look at her closely. Everyone. Those rough, calloused hands that belong wrapped around a mop handle, not admiring instruments worth more than she'll earn in 10 lifetimes. Laughter rippled through the nearby crowd of wealthy patrons who understood Japanese. Billy's confidence grew as he watched the donation notifications flooding his screen. His followers were eating this up, and the wealthy guests were becoming part of the performance. "Tell me," Billy continued in Japanese, his voice rising slightly as he warmed to his theme, "what could a woman like this possibly understand about the soul of craftsmanship, about the years of dedication required to create something truly beautiful? Her world is one of cleaning supplies and minimum wage, hardly the realm of artistic appreciation." More guests gathered around, some pulling out their own phones to record Billy's impromptu performance. The live stream had become an event within an event, and Billy fed off the energy of his growing audience both online and in person. "Perhaps," Billy said, stepping closer to Maggie as his camera captured her profile, "we should ask our friend here what she sees when she looks at this masterpiece. I'm curious to hear how someone from her background interprets fine art." The donations were pouring in now, viewers sending money to encourage Billy's confrontation, treating Maggie's potential humiliation as entertainment worth paying for. The chat exploded with anticipation as Billy's followers sensed something dramatic about to unfold. Maggie hadn't moved from her position before the violin case. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high despite the growing crowd of wealthy spectators surrounding her. The woman who had spent 27 years making herself invisible to survive was now the center of attention for millions of viewers worldwide. Billy moved closer, his phone's camera now capturing both their faces as he prepared to deliver what he knew would become his most viral moment yet. The wealthy crowd pressed in, their phones creating a circle of recording devices around the serving woman and the tech billionaire. "I'm genuinely curious," Billy said loudly, now speaking in English for his broader audience, his voice carrying a mock sincerity that barely concealed his contempt. "Tell us, what do you think of when you see something like this?" The ballroom fell silent except for the soft pings of incoming donations and the barely audible hum of multiple live streams broadcasting the moment across the globe. Margaret Thompson slowly turned from the violin display, her eyes meeting Billy Richardson's camera with a steadiness that made several onlookers step back instinctively. The woman who had been invisible moments before now commanded the attention of everyone in the ballroom and millions watching online. When she spoke, her voice carried the refined diction of classical training, each syllable precisely articulated. "Kono bayorin wa naite imasu," she said, her Japanese flowing with the fluency of a native speaker. "This violin is crying." The crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the live stream. Billy's confident smirk faltered as Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Sore wa machigata choshi de choritsu sarete iru kara desu," she continued, her eyes never leaving Billy's increasingly pale face. "Because it has been tuned incorrectly." Several Japanese guests in the crowd began translating frantically for their companions. Billy's phone trembled slightly in his hand as his carefully orchestrated moment began spiraling beyond his control. The chat exploded with confusion and excitement as viewers sensed the power dynamic shifting dramatically. Maggie stepped closer to the display case, her weathered hands gesturing gracefully toward the instrument. "But perhaps," she said, switching seamlessly to English while maintaining the formal cadence of her Japanese, "you were referring to these hands when you spoke of understanding craftsmanship." She held up her calloused palms for Billy's camera to capture, the harsh ballroom lights revealing every scar, every line etched by decades of hard work. "These hands have indeed known mops and cleaning supplies, as you so eloquently observed. They have also known piano keys, violin strings, and the weight of a conductor's baton." The donations on Billy's live stream slowed to a trickle as viewers struggled to process what they were witnessing. The wealthy crowd pressed closer, phones capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming the most unexpected confrontation of the social season. "You quoted Basho earlier," Maggie continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying classical literature. "But you misremembered the verse. Allow me to correct you." She clasped her hands behind her back and recited in perfect Japanese, "Kono michi ya yuku hito nashi ni aki no kure." "This road, with no one traveling on it, autumn evening approaches." Her voice carried the haunting rhythm of traditional poetry. The great poet wrote of solitude and dignity in humble circumstances. Perhaps more relevant to our situation tonight. Billy's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. His followers were abandoning his stream in droves, flooding to other social media platforms to share clips of the serving woman who had just dismantled a billionaire's arrogance with classical poetry. "You see," Maggie said, moving closer to the violin case and examining the instrument with obvious expertise. "This Stradivarius has been improperly maintained. The G string is a quarter tone flat, and the bridge has shifted slightly to the left. Whoever last handled it understood its monetary value but not its musical soul." She turned back to Billy, whose camera now captured his stunned silence instead of his usual confident commentary. "I understand your confusion about my qualifications to appreciate such an instrument. After all, how could someone in my position," she gestured to her uniform, "possibly comprehend the years of dedication required to create something truly beautiful?" The crowd around them had grown silent, wealthy patrons lowering their phones as they recognized they were witnessing something far more significant than viral entertainment. Even the waitstaff had stopped their service to listen. "The answer," Maggie continued, her voice rising with quiet authority, "is that these hands have created beauty. They have coaxed music from strings, guided students through their first scales, and applauded from orchestra pits as young musicians discovered their voices." She moved to stand directly in front of Billy, close enough that his camera captured the intelligence blazing in her eyes. "They have also sacrificed everything: career, recognition, financial security to ensure that love survives in a world that too often mistakes wealth for worth." Billy finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. I didn't... You didn't know," Maggie finished for him. "You saw only the uniform, only the surface. You assumed that hardship equals ignorance, that service work diminishes dignity. In your language, both English and Japanese, you reduced me to a stereotype for the entertainment of strangers." The live stream numbers were plummeting as viewers fled to other platforms, sharing and resharing clips of Maggie's response. Violin Woman was already trending worldwide, but not in the way Billy had intended. "This instrument," Maggie said, placing her hand gently against the glass case, "was crafted by Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù in 1923. It's not actually a Stradivarius, though the mistake is understandable given the similar craftsmanship. The real tragedy is that it's been silent for months because no one here understands how to properly care for it." She looked around the crowd of wealthy faces, then back at Billy's camera. "Money can purchase beautiful things, Mr. Richardson, but it cannot purchase the wisdom to understand them, the skill to maintain them, or the soul to bring them to life." Billy's hand holding the phone began to shake visibly. The confident tech mogul who had built an empire on his ability to read and manipulate social situations found himself completely outmaneuvered by a woman he had dismissed as beneath his notice. The saddest part, Maggie concluded, her voice softening with something that might have been pity, is that you possess the resources to create genuine beauty in this world. Instead, you choose to build your reputation by tearing others down. That violin is not the only thing in this room that's been poorly maintained. The ballroom erupted in whispers and hurried conversations as Maggie turned away from Billy's frozen form and walked calmly back toward the kitchen, leaving behind a tech billionaire whose entire worldview had just been shattered by a woman in a service uniform who spoke 7 languages and could tune a violin by ear. Act A, the performance. The auction continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Wealthy patrons whispered among themselves, their phones buzzing with notifications as clips of Maggie's confrontation with Billy spread across social media platforms. The tech billionaire stood frozen near the violin display, his live stream numbers continuing their catastrophic decline as viewers migrated to witness the aftermath of his public humiliation. Sarah Mitchell, the event organizer, approached the microphone with visible concern. She had watched her friend's extraordinary response to Billy's cruelty, but now faced the challenge of salvaging a charity auction that had devolved into viral entertainment. The evening's primary goal, raising money for the children's cancer ward at Mount Sinai Hospital, hung in the balance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the ballroom's nervous energy, "we'll now proceed with the auction of this exceptional instrument. As we've just learned from an unexpected expert in our midst, this 1923 Guarneri del Gesù deserves proper appreciation." The crowd settled into an uneasy attention, but their focus remained divided between the violin and the serving woman who had revealed depths no one had suspected. Billy remained motionless, his camera still recording but his commentary completely absent. From the back of the ballroom, Maggie's voice rose clearly above the whispers. "Might I suggest," she called out, her tone respectful but confident, "that before this beautiful instrument changes hands, someone should demonstrate its true capabilities. Music, after all, is meant to be heard, not merely admired behind glass." Dr. Emily Chen, sitting at table 12, recognized something in Maggie's voice, a professional authority that transcended social boundaries. "I think that's an excellent idea," she said, standing from her seat. "Would you be willing to play for us?" The ballroom erupted in murmurs of anticipation and disbelief. Sarah looked between Maggie and the violin, then made a decision that would change everything. "If the instrument's current owner consents, I think we'd all be honored to hear it played properly." The violin's elderly owner, philanthropist Harrison Whitmore, nodded eagerly. "Please, yes. It's been too long since that violin sang." Maggie walked forward through the crowd, her posture transforming with each step. The invisible service worker gradually revealed herself as someone who belonged on concert stages, not serving them. When she reached the display case, her hands moved with practiced efficiency, carefully lifting the instrument and examining it with professional expertise. "The tuning is indeed problematic," she murmured, adjusting the strings with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. Giuseppe would be horrified. She positioned the violin against her shoulder, and in that moment, 27 years of hidden identity fell away. This was Margaret Thompson as she had once been, as she had always been, beneath the uniforms and exhaustion and financial desperation. The first notes floated across the ballroom like a whispered prayer. Maggie's fingers found the melody of an old lullaby, something simple and heartbreaking that seemed to reach directly into the souls of everyone present. The haunting strain carried the weight of loss, love, and enduring hope. Billy's phone slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering to the marble floor as the music washed over him. The melody was achingly familiar, something from the deepest recesses of memory, from a time before consciousness had fully formed. Tears began streaming down his face as fragments of forgotten dreams surfaced, a woman's voice singing softly in the darkness, gentle hands stroking his hair, the feeling of being completely, unconditionally loved. The ballroom fell into absolute silence except for the violin's ethereal voice. Wealthy patrons found themselves crying without understanding why. Servers stopped their work to listen. Even the most hardened society figures felt something stirring in their chests, a recognition of beauty that transcended monetary value. Maggie played with her eyes closed, pouring decades of suppressed artistry into each note. The lullaby spoke of sacrifices made in darkness, of love given without expectation of return, of the countless mothers who had sung their children to sleep with this same gentle melody across generations. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for long moments. Billy stood with tears streaming down his face, his entire body shaking as childhood memories crashed over him like waves. The lullaby had unlocked something he hadn't realized was buried, the only clear memory he possessed of his birth mother's voice. The audience erupted into spontaneous applause, but Maggie barely noticed. Her eyes had found Billy across the crowded ballroom, and she saw in his tear-stained face a recognition that made her own heart race with dangerous hope and terrible fear. Act B, First Revelation. As Maggie carefully returned the violin to its case, the crowd's applause continued with genuine appreciation rather than social obligation. She had transformed the evening from awkward confrontation into transcendent musical experience, but the cost of revealing her abilities was becoming apparent. Whispered questions followed her movements. Who was she really? How did a serving woman possess such extraordinary talent? Billy wiped his face with shaking hands, struggling to process the emotional avalanche triggered by the lullaby. That melody had been the soundtrack to his earliest, most precious memory, the only connection he retained to the mother who had died giving him life. Hearing it played with such heartbreaking beauty by the woman he had just publicly humiliated created a cognitive dissonance that left him reeling. As Maggie moved away from the violin display, her sleeve caught on the edge of the case's brass fitting. The fabric pulled back, revealing a plastic hospital bracelet wrapped around her wrist. The distinctive blue color and Mount Sinai Hospital logo were clearly visible before she quickly tugged her uniform back into place. Dr. Emily Chen, who had been approaching to congratulate Maggie on her performance, froze when she spotted the bracelet. As head of pediatric oncology at Mount Sinai, she recognized the specific coding that indicated ongoing treatment rather than visitation privileges. Billy, still struggling with the emotional impact of the lullaby, noticed the exchange of glances between the doctor and Maggie. His business instincts, temporarily overwhelmed by personal trauma, began reasserting themselves as he processed this new information. "Excuse me, Dr. Chen said gently, stepping closer to Maggie. "I couldn't help but notice. Are you currently receiving treatment at Mount Sinai?" Maggie's composure flickered for the first time that evening. "I'm sorry. I should return to my duties," she said, attempting to move past the doctor. "Wait," Billy interjected, his voice hoarse from crying but carrying urgent intensity. "Mount Sinai. This entire auction is raising money for Mount Sinai's Children's Cancer Ward." The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. The charity auction that Billy had turned into viral entertainment was funding the very department where Maggie wore a patient bracelet. Dr. Chen's presence at the event, Maggie's knowledge of the hospital, the desperation that had driven her to work as servers despite her obvious qualifications, it painted a picture that made Billy's stomach lurch with guilt. "You volunteer there?" Dr. Chen said, recognition dawning in her voice. "You're Margaret Thompson. You work in our family support services." Maggie nodded reluctantly. "I help families navigate the system when their children when they need specialized care." "My God," Billy whispered, understanding crashing over him like a physical blow. "Your grandson, Tommy Thompson. I've seen his name on our donation processing reports." The wealthy crowd around them had grown silent again, sensing another dramatic revelation. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the circle of onlookers, concern etched across her features as she realized her friend was being cornered. "Tommy is 12 years old," Maggie said quietly, her professional composure beginning to crack. "He's been fighting acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 3 years. The treatments, they're not covered entirely by insurance." Billy's face had gone pale as he processed the implications. He had spent the evening mocking and humiliating a woman who was fighting to save her grandson's life with money raised by the very event he had turned into cruel entertainment for millions of viewers. The violin sale. Doctor, Chen said softly, pieces clicking together in her medical mind. Years ago, there was an anonymous donation that funded several emergency surgeries. The money came from the sale of a valuable instrument. Maggie's eyes widened in surprise and something approaching alarm. How could you possibly know about that? Because I was the resident who assisted with one of those surgeries. Doctor, Chen replied. A child in foster care, emergency kidney surgery. The donation came through just in time, completely anonymous, along with a note saying the money came from selling a violin to save a life. Billy staggered backward as if physically struck. The timeline was impossible to ignore 27 years ago. Emergency surgery for a foster child, funded by the anonymous sale of a violin by someone who clearly understood its true value. That was you, he breathed, staring at Maggie with dawning horror and recognition. You saved my life. The admission hung in the air like a thunderclap. The wealthy crowd pressed closer, phones appearing again as they sensed another twist in what was becoming the most dramatic charity auction in Manhattan's social history. Maggie shook her head firmly. I think you're mistaken. I should really return to work. No, Billy said, his voice growing stronger with certainty. The surgery was at Mount Sinai. Emergency kidney surgery for a 7-year-old boy in foster care. I remember the scar. I remember the recovery. I remember being told that an anonymous donor had made it possible. Sarah grabbed Maggie's arm gently. Maggie, is this true? Did you save his life? I saved a child's life, Maggie said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. Any parent would have done the same. The word parent sent another shock through Billy's system. But you weren't a parent then. You were. He stopped speaking as the full magnitude of what was unfolding began to dawn on him. The lullaby, the surgery, the decades of hidden connection threads of a story he had never imagined were weaving together before his eyes. Act C, Deepening Mystery. Billy excused himself abruptly, his mind racing as he stepped away from the crowd surrounding Maggie. He pulled out his backup phone and began making calls with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire understanding of reality was crumbling. His first call was to his private investigator, demanding an emergency background check on Margaret Thompson, every detail available within the hour. While waiting for results, Billy used his resources to access Mount Sinai's historical records through a contact on the hospital's board of directors. What he found in the children's surgery files from 27 years ago made his hands shake as he scrolled through the data. The anonymous donation had been exactly $127,000, enough to cover emergency surgery and 6 months of aftercare for a critically ill 7-year-old boy identified only as William R. The money had arrived in the form of a cashier's check accompanied by documentation proving the sale of a 1894 Giovanni Battista Guadagnini violin to a private collector in Switzerland. Billy's investigation deepened as he cross-referenced the violin sale with estate records and auction house databases. The instrument had been registered to one Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, age 31, listed profession classical violinist and private music instructor. The sale had been completed through Sotheby's with explicit instructions that the buyer's identity and the seller's identity both remain permanently confidential. His private investigator's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email 40 minutes later, and the contents left Billy sitting in stunned silence in the hotel's private business center. Margaret Thompson's background read like a catalog of sacrifices and hidden achievements that painted a picture of someone far more complex than he had ever imagined. Juilliard School of Music, graduated summa cum laude, 1987, full scholarship recipient, concert performance track, Carnegie Hall debut at age 23 with the New York Philharmonic, rising star trajectory until 1994 when she abruptly withdrew from all professional engagements. Marriage records showed Margaret Elizabeth Thompson wed Robert James Thompson, a military serviceman, in 1993. Birth records indicated the birth of David Michael Thompson in 1995. Military casualty reports confirmed Robert Thompson's death in Iraq in 2003, but the most shocking discovery was buried in the foster care system's confidential records, accessible only through Billy's substantial influence and connections. Cross-referencing dates and locations revealed a pattern that made Billy's chest tighten with realization. Margaret Thompson had been present at every major milestone in his life, always in the background, always in service positions that allowed her to observe without being noticed. She had worked as a substitute teacher at his private elementary school. She had been employed by the catering company that handled his high school graduation celebration. She had cleaned the offices of his first startup company 3 nights a week for 2 years. The investigation revealed that she had deliberately sought employment opportunities that would allow her to monitor his progress from a distance. School records, medical files, business documents wherever Billy Richardson's name appeared. Margaret Thompson had found ways to ensure she could track his welfare without direct contact. Billy's phone rang, interrupting his research. His adoptive father, James Richardson's voice carried unusual urgency as he spoke from his winter home in Florida. "Billy, I just saw the news coverage of tonight's auction. The woman who played the violin, I need you to tell me her full name." "Margaret Thompson," Billy replied, his voice hollow with shock. "Dad, I think she's the one who saved my life when I was 7, the anonymous donor who paid for my surgery." A long silence stretched across the phone line before James Richardson spoke again, his voice heavy with decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Billy, you need to come home, tonight. There are things about your adoption, about your birth family, that your mother and I should have told you years ago, Margaret Thompson. She's not just some stranger who happened to help you." "What do you mean?" Billy demanded, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "She's been watching over you your entire life because she promised someone she would. Someone who loved you more than her own life and made Margaret swear to protect you from the shadows." Billy's world tilted on its axis as he processed this revelation. Who did she promise?" "Your birth mother's twin sister," James said quietly. "Margaret Thompson is your aunt. Billy, she's been your guardian angel for 27 years, and we've been keeping her away from you because we were afraid of losing you to the only blood family you had left." The phone slipped from Billy's numb fingers as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The lullaby wasn't just familiar because his birth mother had sung it. It was familiar because Margaret had been singing it to him from the day he was born, carrying on her sister's legacy through decades of silent love and sacrifice. Everything made terrible. Beautiful sense the way she had looked at him during their confrontation, the pain in her eyes when she spoke of hands that had sacrificed everything for love, the decades of hidden presence at the edges of his life. Margaret Thompson hadn't been stalking him. She had been honoring a dying sister's final wish to ensure he never faced the world alone. Billy staggered back toward the ballroom, his mind reeling with the knowledge that the woman he had publicly humiliated was the person who had loved him longest and sacrificed most for his survival. The cruel irony was overwhelming in his moment of greatest arrogance. He had unknowingly attacked the one person who had never stopped fighting for his welfare. As he reached the ballroom entrance, he could see Margaret through the crowd, back in her service role, quietly clearing tables while the auction continued around her. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the evening. But now, Billy could see the weight she carried 27 years of loving someone from a distance. Watching him succeed while knowing she could never claim the relationship that bound them together. The most successful man in the room was about to discover that his greatest achievement was simply surviving long enough to recognize the woman whose love had made everything else possible. Public showdown. Billy Richardson arrived at Mount Sinai Hospital at 7 o'clock the following morning, his Bentley pulling into the visitor parking garage with uncharacteristic urgency. He had spent the night consumed by his father's revelations, pacing his penthouse while trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. Margaret Thompson wasn't just the woman who had saved his life, she was family. Blood family. The only living connection to his birth mother. And he had publicly humiliated her in front of millions of people. The pediatric oncology ward buzzed with typical morning activity as Billy navigated the corridors. his expensive suit drawing curious glances from medical staff accustomed to seeing parents in various states of emotional distress rather than billionaires in hand-tailored clothing. He followed the signs toward the Family Support Services office, where his research had indicated Margaret spent her volunteer hours when she wasn't working catering jobs. Through the office's glass door, Billy could see Margaret sitting at a small desk, helping a young Hispanic couple fill out insurance paperwork. She had traded her server's uniform for simple civilian clothes, jeans, and a faded blue sweater that had seen better years, but her posture remained straight and dignified. Her voice carried the same patient authority he had witnessed at the auction as she explained complex medical billing procedures in Spanish, then English, then what sounded like Portuguese to accommodate the couple's linguistic comfort. Billy pushed through the door without knocking, his entrance causing both Margaret and the family she was helping to look up in surprise. Recognition flashed across Margaret's face, followed immediately by something approaching fear. "Mr. Richardson," she said carefully, rising from her chair. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." The young couple gathered their paperwork quickly, sensing tension they didn't want to be part of. Margaret spoke to them in gentle Spanish, assuring them she would find them later to finish their forms, before turning back to face Billy with wary composure. "We need to talk," Billy said, his voice carrying the commanding tone that had built his business empire but none of its usual confidence. "About last night, about the surgery 27 years ago, about why you've been watching me my entire life." Margaret's composure flickered, but she maintained her professional demeanor. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Richardson. I volunteer here because I believe in the hospital's mission, not because of any personal connection to you." "Don't lie to me," Billy said, stepping closer. "I spent all night investigating your background. The violin sale, the anonymous donation, the timing of the surgery, it all matches perfectly. You saved my life when I was 7 years old. Many people have contributed to this hospital's success over the years," Margaret replied carefully. "I'm honored that you think I might have helped, but—" "Stop it!" Billy's voice rose sharply, causing nurses in the hallway to turn their heads. "I know you're my aunt. I know my birth mother was your twin sister. My adoptive father told me everything last night." The color drained from Margaret's face as her carefully constructed defenses crumbled. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she processed the fact that the secret she had protected for nearly 3 decades had finally been exposed. "James told you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He told me that you've been watching over me because you promised my birth mother you would," Billy said, his anger beginning to mix with desperation. "He told me that you've been working service jobs at my events, that you've been following my career, that you've sacrificed your own life to honor some deathbed promise to a sister I never even knew." Margaret looked up at him with eyes that carried decades of suppressed pain. "Your birth mother loved you more than life itself. She made me promise that I would ensure you never felt abandoned, never felt unloved, even if you never knew I existed." "But I did feel abandoned," Billy exploded. "I felt unloved my entire childhood. The Richardsons gave me everything except the one thing I needed most, the feeling that I mattered to someone beyond what I could achieve." "You mattered to me," Margaret said quietly. "You mattered more than anything in the world. Watching you grow up, seeing you succeed, knowing you were safe and healthy, that was enough. It had to be enough." Billy stared at her in disbelief. "Enough? You think watching from the shadows was enough? Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up feeling like an obligation, like something purchased rather than loved? Do you have any idea what it's like to love someone so completely that you give up everything to protect them, knowing they'll never even know your name?" Margaret fired back, her own emotions finally breaking through. "I gave up my career, my financial security, my entire identity to ensure you had the best possible life. I watched you from kitchen windows and service entrances while you lived in mansions, and I was grateful for every glimpse." Before Billy could respond, the office door opened behind him. James Richardson entered, his 70-year-old frame moving with the deliberate pace of someone carrying heavy emotional burdens. Behind him came an elderly woman Billy didn't recognize, Patricia Richardson's sister Helen, who had flown in from Boston overnight. Margaret, James said softly, his voice carrying a mixture of guilt and recognition. It's been too long. Margaret stood slowly, her entire body tensing as she faced the man who had legally adopted her nephew and systematically prevented her from having any relationship with him. James, I wondered if this day would ever come. Helen insisted on coming, James said, gesturing to his sister-in-law. She said it was time Billy knew the whole truth, not just the version we've been telling ourselves. Billy looked between the three adults, confusion replacing his anger as he realized there were still layers to this story that remained hidden. What truth, what version? Helen Richardson stepped forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades as a family court judge. The truth about how we really acquired custody of you, Billy, and why your aunt was never allowed to be part of your life. Truth emerges. Helen Richardson moved to stand beside Margaret, her presence seeming to provide the older woman with strength she had been lacking. Billy, what your parents told you about Margaret voluntarily staying away isn't entirely accurate. The real story is much more complicated and far less noble. James Richardson's face flushed with embarrassment and long-suppressed guilt. Helen, perhaps this isn't the appropriate time or place. This is exactly the appropriate time and place. Helen interrupted firmly. This woman has spent 27 years believing she wasn't worthy to be part of her own nephew's life because we convinced her it was in your best interests. Billy, the least we can do is tell the truth. Billy looked between his father and aunt, then at Margaret, who had gone very still. What truth, Dad? You said she promised to watch over me from a distance. She did make that promise, James admitted reluctantly. But the distance wasn't her choice. Helen pulled out her phone and began reading from what appeared to be old legal documents she had photographed. When you were 7 and needed that emergency surgery, Margaret sold her violin and used every penny to save your life. But instead of being grateful, your parents saw it as a threat to their custody. That's not entirely fair, James protested. We were grateful, but we were also concerned about what? Margaret spoke for the first time since the others had arrived. About the fact that I could prove I was willing to sacrifice everything for Billy while you had done nothing but provide money and legal paperwork. Helen continued reading from her phone. Patricia hired investigators to research Margaret's background. When they discovered she was a twin sister rather than the birth mother, and when they learned about her financial struggles as a widow with an autistic son, they decided she represented a custody risk. Billy felt sick as the implications became clear. You threatened her. You threatened her to stay away from me. We protected you from instability, James said defensively. Margaret was working multiple jobs, struggling to care for her own child. We could provide you with educational opportunities, financial security, a stable home environment. A stable home environment, Margaret repeated bitterly. One where he grew up feeling like an acquisition rather than a beloved child. Helen held up her hand to silence James's next protest. The legal documents are very clear about what happened next. Patricia and James filed for a restraining order claiming Margaret was stalking Billy. They threatened to have her arrested if she came within 500 feet of him. The office fell silent except for the sound of Billy's rapid breathing. A restraining order. You had a restraining order against the woman who saved my life. We were protecting our family, James said weakly. I was never a threat to your family, Margaret said, her voice carrying decades of suppressed hurt. I just wanted to know that my sister's son was okay, that he was happy, that he knew someone loved him unconditionally. Helen consulted her phone again. The restraining order was eventually dropped, but by then Margaret had learned her lesson. She found other ways to stay connected working for companies that catered your events, volunteering at organizations you supported, always maintaining distance but never completely letting go. Billy turned to face Margaret directly. All those times I felt like someone was watching out for me. All those moments when things worked out when they shouldn't have, that was you, wasn't it? Margaret nodded slowly. The scholarship money that appeared when your startup needed funding. The medical specialists who agreed to see you when you had pneumonia in college. The reference letters that helped you get your first major contracts. I couldn't be your aunt, So I tried to be your guardian angel. My God, Billy whispered. How much money did you spend on me over the years? Everything, Margaret said simply. Every penny I could spare. Every favor I could call in. Every connection I could use. Your birth mother made me promise you would never want for anything. And I kept that promise the only way I was allowed to. James Richardson looked stricken as the full extent of Margaret's sacrifices became apparent. We never knew about the ongoing support. We assumed you had moved on with your life. I did move on, Margaret said with quiet dignity. I built a life around loving someone I was forbidden to know. I made peace with watching my nephew become a successful man while believing I was nothing more than a stranger who once helped him. Helen put away her phone and addressed Billy directly. Your aunt has spent 27 years honoring your birth mother's dying wish while being treated like a potential criminal by the people who adopted you. The least you can do is acknowledge the magnitude of her sacrifice. Billy stared at Margaret, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as the serving woman he had humiliated, not as the mysterious benefactor who had saved his life, but as family. As the woman who had loved him continuously and unconditionally since the day he was born, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that he was safe and happy. The letter, Billy said suddenly. Dad mentioned that my birth mother left a letter. What did it say? James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope yellowed with age. I brought it with me. I thought it was time you read what she wrote. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the handwriting on the envelope. I haven't seen that since the day she died. Billy took the envelope with trembling hands, opened it carefully, and began to read aloud the words his birth mother had written just hours before her death. Words that would finally reveal the true extent of the love that had surrounded him his entire life. Even when he couldn't see it. The hidden story. Billy's hands shook as he unfolded the yellowed paper, his birth mother's handwriting still clear despite the passage of nearly 3 decades. The letter was brief, written in the careful script of someone fighting exhaustion and pain. But every word carried the weight of desperate love. My dearest Margaret, Billy read aloud, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke his birth mother's final words. If you are reading this, then our worst fears have come true, and I will not survive childbirth. Please don't blame yourself. We both knew this was possible when we learned about my heart condition. Margaret wiped tears from her cheeks, remembering that terrible night when her twin sister had insisted on writing these final instructions despite the doctor's assurances that surgery would save both mother and child. Billy continued reading. I need you to promise me something that will change your entire life. Promise me that you will love my son as if he were your own. Not from close by, where it would be easy and natural, but from whatever distance life requires. Love him when he cannot see you. Protect him when he doesn't know he needs protection. Sacrifice for him when he will never know what you've given up. James Richardson shifted uncomfortably as the letter revealed the depths of promises he had never fully understood. Helen maintained her stern expression, but her eyes showed growing recognition of the magnitude of what Margaret had undertaken. The Richardsons are good people who will provide him with opportunities I never could. Billy read, his voice growing stronger as he connected with his birth mother's words. But they will give him things. Margaret, you must give him something more precious, the knowledge that he is loved without conditions, without expectations, without limits. Even if he never knows your name, he must feel in his heart that someone in this world would sacrifice everything for his happiness. Billy paused, looking up at Margaret, who had covered her face with her hands. There's more, he said softly, then continued reading. I know what I'm asking of you. I know it means giving up your music career, your dreams, your own chances for happiness. I know it means loving someone who may never love you back, protecting someone who may never know you exist. But Margaret, my darling sister, you are the only person I trust to love him the way he deserves to be loved completely, sacrificially, eternally. The letter concluded with specific instructions about maintaining distance while ensuring Billy's welfare, about finding ways to contribute to his life without claiming credit, about being willing to step back entirely if her presence ever threatened his stability or happiness. Love him for both of us. Billy finished reading. Love him enough to let him go if necessary, and love him enough to never truly let him go. He will be the most important thing you will ever do with your life. Thank you for giving me the peace to die, knowing he will never be alone. Your sister always, Elizabeth. The silence that followed was broken only by Margaret's quiet sobbing. Billy carefully refolded the letter, finally understanding the impossible burden his aunt had carried for 27 years. You did it, Billy said quietly. You kept every promise she asked you to make. Margaret looked up, her face wet with tears. I tried so hard, but I failed her in so many ways. I let you grow up feeling unloved when loving you was the most important thing I was supposed to do. You didn't fail, Billy said, moving closer to her chair. I felt unloved because the Richardsons treated me like a project to be perfected. But there were moments, so many moments, when I felt like someone was watching over me, like someone cared about my happiness even when no one was around to see it. That was you, wasn't it? Margaret nodded, wiping her eyes with tissues Helen offered her. Every scholarship that appeared when you needed money, every reference letter that opened doors, every medical specialist who agreed to see you when you were sick, every business connection that helped your career. I couldn't give you hugs or birthday parties, and so I gave you everything else I could think of. James Richardson spoke for the first time since the letter reading. Margaret, we had no idea about the ongoing financial support. We thought your involvement ended after the surgery. The surgery was just the beginning, Margaret said with bitter irony. Do you want to know what I really sacrificed to save Billy's life? Not just a violin, James. Not just my musical career. I sold my kidney. The room erupted in shocked gasps. Billy stepped backward as if physically struck. What do you mean you sold your kidney? Helen demanded. Margaret stood slowly, pulling up her sweater to reveal a surgical scar along her left side. The violin sale covered the surgery costs, but Billy needed ongoing medical care for months afterward. Kidney function problems, complications from the surgery. I found a buyer through medical connections, someone who paid $50,000 for a healthy kidney from a compatible donor. That's illegal, James protested. It was gray market medical tourism, Margaret explained. Legal in the country where the procedure happened. Invisible to American authorities. The money paid for Billy's follow-up care and covered my expenses while I recovered from major surgery. Billy stared at the scar, processing the reality that his aunt had literally given him parts of her body to keep him alive. You could have died from that procedure. I nearly did, Margaret admitted. But Billy needed those treatments, and I had no other way to pay for them. So I gave up a kidney, spent 6 weeks recovering in a foreign clinic, and came home to discover that the Richardsons had filed for a restraining order against me while I was gone. The cruel timing was not lost on anyone in the room. While Margaret had been recovering from surgery she had undergone to save Billy's life, his adoptive parents had been working to legally ban her from his presence. Every dollar I've earned since then has gone toward his welfare, Margaret continued. College funds, business investments, medical care. I've lived in the same studio apartment for 20 years because every penny I could spare went to making sure Elizabeth's son had every opportunity in the world. Billy slumped into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of sacrifices he had never imagined. My God, what kind of life have you had? What have you done for yourself in all these years? Margaret smiled sadly. I raised my own son. I helped families at the hospital. I played music in my apartment late at night when no one could hear. I watched you become successful and brilliant and everything your mother hoped you would be. That was enough. Enough. Billy's voice rose with anguish. You gave up everything, your career, your health, your financial security, your family connections. How could that possibly be enough? Because I loved you, Margaret said simply. Love doesn't calculate costs or keep score. Love just gives whatever is needed and finds joy in the giving. Current crisis. Before Billy could respond, Margaret's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. She glanced at it and immediately went pale, her hands shaking as she read the screen. "What is it?" Helen asked, noticing Margaret's distress. Margaret stared at her phone for a long moment before looking up with eyes full of devastation. "It's Tommy, my grandson. He's been readmitted to the emergency room." Dr. Emily Chen appeared in the doorway as if summoned by the mention of her patient. "Margaret, I've been looking for you. We need to talk about Tommy's latest test results." The timing felt surreal, as if the universe was determined to test how much tragedy one family could absorb in a single day. Billy watched Margaret transform from grieving aunt back into protective grandmother, her posture straightening despite the emotional exhaustion. "What's wrong with him?" Margaret asked Dr. Chen. "His leukemia has returned." Dr. Chen said gently, "The latest blood work shows aggressive progression. We need to discuss immediate treatment options." Billy felt the world tilting around him as he realized Margaret was facing another medical crisis with her grandchild, the same situation that had driven her to work multiple jobs and sacrifice her health for income. "What kind of treatment?" Margaret asked, though her voice suggested she already feared the answer. "Bone marrow transplant," Dr. Chen replied. "It's his best chance for long-term survival, but we need to find a compatible donor quickly." Margaret closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. "Have you tested family members?" "You're the closest genetic match we have," Dr. Chen explained. "In fact, you're an excellent match. The procedure would likely be very successful if we can schedule it within the next few weeks." Billy watched Margaret's face crumble as the full implications became clear. "Margaret, what aren't you telling us?" Dr. Chen looked confused by the question until she noticed the hospital bracelet on Margaret's wrist. "Margaret, you're not just volunteering here, are you? You're receiving treatment." Margaret nodded slowly, defeat evident in every line of her body. "Stage 3 pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 8 months ago. I've been undergoing chemotherapy while working to save enough money for Tommy's care." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Helen gasped audibly. James stepped backward in shock, and Billy felt his legs give out as he sank into a chair. "Pancreatic cancer," he whispered. "That's terminal," Margaret finished for him. "Yes, the treatments are buying me time, but not much. 6 months. Maybe 8 if I'm lucky." Dr. Sao Chen's professional composure wavered as she processed this information. "Margaret, chemotherapy would compromise your immune system significantly. Donating bone marrow while undergoing cancer treatment would be extremely dangerous." "How dangerous?" Margaret asked quietly. "It could kill you." Dr. Chen admitted, "The stress on your system, combined with your compromised immune response, could accelerate the cancer progression dramatically." Billy stared at Margaret, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. "You're going to do it anyway, aren't you? You're going to give Tommy your bone marrow even though it might kill you." Margaret looked at him with the same expression she had worn while making promises to his dying birth mother 27 years earlier. "Tommy is 12 years old. He has his whole life ahead of him. I'm dying anyway, at least this way. My death might save someone I love." "No," Billy said firmly, standing up with sudden determination. "No. There has to be another way. There has to be another donor option." Dr. Chen consulted her tablet, scrolling through test results. "Actually, there might be. Family members can sometimes be compatible even when they're not as close genetically. We could test extended family members." Billy looked directly at Margaret, then at Dr. Chen. "Test me." "Billy, you're not related to Tommy." Margaret protested. "No, but I might be related to you," Billy said with growing conviction. "If you and my birth mother were identical twins, we share some genetic material. It's worth testing." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "It's possible." Identical twins share the same DNA, so you would carry some of Margaret's genetic markers. It's a long shot, but stranger things have happened. Billy was already rolling up his sleeve. Then let's find out, because I'll be damned if I'm going to let the woman who saved my life die saving someone else when I might be able to help. Margaret stared at him with wonder and terror, realizing that the nephew she had protected from shadows for 27 years was now stepping forward to protect her in return. The circle of sacrifice and love was completing itself in ways none of them had imagined possible. Billy's investigation. Billy's phone buzzed incessantly as he sat in Mount Sinai's family waiting area, fielding calls from his team of private investigators while blood was drawn for genetic compatibility testing. What had started as a simple background check on Margaret Thompson had evolved into the most comprehensive investigation his resources had ever undertaken, and each new discovery left him more stunned than the last. His lead investigator, Marcus Chen, called with preliminary findings that painted a picture of sacrifice so profound it bordered on the incomprehensible. Mr. Richardson, we've traced Margaret Thompson's financial records going back 30 years. What we've found is unprecedented. Tell me everything, Billy said, stepping away from Margaret, who was speaking with Dr. Emily Chen about Tommy's treatment timeline. She's been your anonymous benefactor for virtually your entire life, Marcus reported. Not just the kidney surgery, everything. The scholarship fund that paid for your prep school education funded entirely by Margaret Thompson through a shell corporation she established in 1997. The venture capital that launched your first startup anonymous investor who turned out to be Margaret, using money borrowed against her life insurance policy. Billy leaned against the hospital wall, processing information that rewrote his understanding of his own success. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate over $2 million across 27 years. She's been living on approximately $18,000 annually while directing every other penny toward your welfare and career advancement. The number hit Billy like a physical blow. $2 million represented more money than many people earned in their entire lifetimes, and Margaret had given it all to support someone who didn't even know her name. There's more, Marcus continued. The medical specialists who treated you during college when you had pneumonia, she personally contacted each one, using her connections from her Juilliard days when she knew doctors' wives and hospital board members. The business references that helped you secure your first major contracts. She cultivated relationships with executives specifically to position herself as someone who could open doors for you. Billy's investigation team had uncovered a network of influence Margaret had built over decades, all focused on a single goal: ensuring her nephew's success without ever revealing her involvement. She had worked as a part-time bookkeeper for a consulting firm whose CEO became one of Billy's early mentors. She had volunteered for charity boards that included tech industry leaders who later invested in Billy's companies. The most incredible part, Marcus said, is the sophistication of her planning. She didn't just react to your needs, she anticipated them. When you were still in high school, she was already making connections in the tech industry because she somehow knew that's where your interests were heading. Dr. Chen's tests had confirmed that Billy was indeed a compatible bone marrow donor for Tommy, sharing enough genetic markers through his connection to Margaret's identical twin sister to make the transplant viable. But even as medical staff prepared for the procedure that could save Tommy's life, Billy continued piecing together the full scope of his aunt's devotion. His financial team reported that Margaret's credit history showed consistent patterns of borrowing against future earnings to fund immediate payments toward Billy's expenses. She had taken second mortgages, personal loans, and credit card advances to ensure his tuition payments were never late. His medical bills were always covered. His business ventures had adequate startup capital. She destroyed her own financial security to build yours, his accountant reported. Every time you succeeded, she borrowed more money to invest in your next opportunity. She's been leveraging her future to secure yours for nearly 3 decades. The investigation revealed that Margaret had worked an average of 60 hours per week across multiple jobs since 1995, not because she enjoyed the work, but because every additional dollar earned was immediately directed toward Billy's welfare. Restaurant server, office cleaner, event coordinator, bookkeeper, translator. Whatever work paid well enough to contribute to the carefully managed funds that appeared in Billy's life whenever he needed them most. Billy discovered that his aunt had even sacrificed potential relationships and personal happiness for his welfare. Marriage proposals turned down because the men involved couldn't understand her financial priorities. Career opportunities rejected because they would have required relocating away from Billy's geographic area. Social connections abandoned because maintaining them required time and money she preferred to invest in her nephew's future. The complete truth. The revelation that shattered Billy's remaining composure came from an unexpected source, his own administrative assistant, who had been reviewing Margaret's employment history and discovered something that had escaped the professional investigators. "Mr. Richardson," his assistant called from his office, her voice tight with emotion. "I found something in your personal files that you need to see immediately." Billy took the call while standing beside Margaret, who was reviewing Tommy's treatment schedule with medical staff. "What is it?" "Jennifer, the anonymous letters. The ones you've been receiving every year on your birthday since you were 8 years old. The handwriting analysis confirms they're from Margaret Thompson." Billy felt the blood drain from his face. For 27 years, he had received birthday cards with no return address, each containing a single sentence of encouragement and a small gift card to bookstores or music stores. He had always wondered about their origin, eventually assuming they came from a family friend or distant relative who preferred anonymity. "She's been writing to you every year," Jennifer continued. The lab compared the handwriting to samples from her employment records. Perfect match. Billy looked at Margaret, who was absorbed in medical discussions and unaware that her secret was being exposed. The birthday cards had been one of his most treasured childhood mysteries, evidence that someone in the world cared about his happiness even when his adoptive parents seemed focused primarily on his achievements. Each card had contained messages perfectly calibrated to his age and circumstances. "Smart boys become wise men when they remember to be kind. Your talents are gifts meant to help others. Don't forget to unwrap them. The measure of a man isn't his wealth, but the love he creates in the world." "There's something else," Jennifer said. "The return address analysis shows the cards were mailed from different locations each year, always from wherever you were living or going to school. She's been following your geographic movements to ensure the cards would arrive on time." Billy realized that Margaret hadn't just been monitoring his success from a distance. She had been providing emotional support and guidance through carefully crafted messages designed to shape his character without revealing their source. Every birthday card had been a small act of parenting, delivered anonymously but crafted with profound love. His investigation team had uncovered Margaret's medical records, revealing the true extent of her health sacrifices. The kidney removal had led to chronic health complications that required ongoing medical management. The stress of multiple jobs and financial pressure had contributed to high blood pressure and cardiac issues. The cancer diagnosis 8 months earlier had been detected late because she couldn't afford regular preventive care. "She's been slowly killing herself to keep you healthy," Dr. Chen had told Billy privately. The combination of physical stress, medical procedures, and financial pressure has accelerated her aging process significantly. She's a 58-year-old woman with the health profile of someone 15 years older. Billy discovered that Margaret had been treating her cancer with the least expensive options available, often skipping treatments when the copays competed with Tommy's medical expenses or opportunities to contribute to Billy's ventures. Her oncologist confirmed that more aggressive treatment options existed, but Margaret had consistently chosen less effective therapies to preserve her financial resources for others. The most devastating revelation came from Margaret's personal papers, which her son David had provided to investigators. Among her possessions was a journal she had maintained since Billy's birth, documenting every milestone, achievement, and challenge in his life. The entries revealed a woman who had lived vicariously through her nephew's experiences, celebrating his successes and worrying about his setbacks as if they were her own. "Saw Billy's company featured in Forbes today. Read one entry from 3 years earlier. Felt prouder than when I performed at Carnegie Hall. Elizabeth would have been so happy to see what he's accomplished." Another entry, from just 6 months ago. "Tommy's medical expenses are increasing, but Billy's new venture needs capital for expansion. Took out another loan against the house. Elizabeth always said love means giving until it hurts, then giving more." She was right. Billy realized that his entire life had been shaped by a woman who loved him more than she loved herself, who had guided his development through invisible influence and anonymous generosity, who had created a network of support so sophisticated that he had never questioned why opportunities appeared exactly when he needed them most. Standing in the hospital corridor, watching Margaret comfort Tommy's parents with the same gentle authority she had used to comfort him at the auction, Billy finally understood the magnitude of what his birth mother had asked of her twin sister. Margaret had given up her identity to become his guardian angel, sacrificing her own dreams to ensure his flourished, loving him with a devotion so pure it had never asked for recognition or gratitude. The woman he had publicly humiliated was the person who had loved him most faithfully and sacrificially throughout his entire existence. The cruel irony was that in trying to build his reputation through viral cruelty, he had attacked the one person whose love had made his success possible. Billy approached Margaret as she finished speaking with Tommy's family, knowing that the conversation they were about to have would change both their lives forever. He carried with him the weight of 27 years of unacknowledged love and the determination to spend whatever time Margaret had left showing her the gratitude and devotion she had always deserved. Billy's transformation. 3 days after learning the truth about Margaret's lifelong sacrifice, Billy Richardson stood before a camera crew in his penthouse office, preparing to broadcast what would become the most important live stream of his career. Unlike his usual confident demeanor, he appeared nervous and humbled, his usual designer clothing replaced by a simple black suit that suggested gravitas rather than wealth. "Good evening," Billy began, looking directly into the camera. "3 nights ago, I committed one of the most shameful acts of my public life. I used my platform and influence to mock and humiliate a woman who was working to serve others, and I turned her dignity into entertainment for millions of viewers." The live stream had attracted over 5 million viewers within minutes, drawn by news reports that the viral violin woman confrontation had led to shocking revelations about hidden family connections. Social media buzzed with speculation about what Billy might reveal. What I didn't know, what I had no excuse not to know, was that the woman I humiliated was my aunt. Margaret Thompson is my birth mother's twin sister, and she has spent the last 27 years anonymously supporting every aspect of my life and career. Billy paused, his composure wavering as he processed the magnitude of what he was revealing to the world. She saved my life when I was 7 by selling her violin and donating her kidney to pay for emergency surgery. She funded my education, my business ventures, and my success through decades of personal sacrifice while working multiple jobs and living in poverty. The viewer count climbed past 10 million as Billy's confession spread across social media platforms. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of hidden family sacrifice and anonymous generosity. Margaret Thompson represents everything noble about human nature that I have spent my career mocking and exploiting, Billy continued. She loved without expectation of recognition, gave without hope of repayment, and sacrificed without asking for gratitude. While I built my reputation by tearing others down, she built my entire life by lifting me up from shadows I never knew existed. Billy looked down at papers on his desk, gathering strength for the next part of his announcement. Effective immediately, I am liquidating my entire personal fortune and business empire. Every asset, every investment, every dollar will be donated to establish the Elizabeth and Margaret Thompson Foundation for Pediatric Cancer Research and Family Support Services at Mount Sinai Hospital. The announcement sent shockwaves through the financial world and social media landscape. Billy Richardson, worth an estimated $2.8 billion, was giving away everything to honor the woman he had humiliated and the birth mother he had never known. I am also donating bone marrow to save the life of Tommy Thompson, Margaret's 12-year-old grandson who is fighting leukemia, Billy continued. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow, and I consider it the greatest privilege of my life to be able to give something back to the family that has given me everything. Billy's voice strengthened as he reached the heart of his message. I spent my career teaching people that success means accumulating wealth and influence over others. Margaret Thompson taught me that true success means giving your life away for love. I'm finally ready to learn from the right teacher. He looked directly into the camera for his closing words. To everyone who followed my content, shared my streams, and supported my platforms. I hope you'll redirect that energy toward people like Margaret Thompson, who work quietly and sacrificially to make the world better. Look for the server who speaks 7 languages, the janitor who has a PhD, the woman in the uniform who once commanded standing ovations. They are everywhere around us, and they deserve our recognition and respect. The live stream concluded with Billy walking away from his camera setup, symbolically ending his career as a social media influencer and beginning his journey toward becoming the man his birth mother and aunt had always hoped he could be. Medical tests confirmed that Billy was indeed an excellent bone marrow match for Tommy, sharing enough genetic compatibility through his connection to Margaret's identical twin DNA to make the transplant highly likely to succeed. Dr. Chen scheduled the procedure for the following week, giving both donor and recipient time to prepare for the life-saving surgery. Billy spent the days before surgery with Margaret and Tommy, finally experiencing the family connections that had been hidden from him for nearly 3 decades. He met David, Margaret's autistic son who worked as a computer programmer and shared Billy's love for complex systems and logical problem-solving. He spent hours with Tommy, playing video games and listening to stories about his grandmother's strength and kindness during his cancer treatments. Family reunion. The bone marrow transplant surgery proceeded without complications, and within weeks, Tommy's blood work showed remarkable improvement. Dr. Chen pronounced the procedure a complete success, with Tommy's body accepting Billy's donation and beginning to produce healthy blood cells for the first time in months. Billy used his recovery time to finalize arrangements for Margaret's financial security and medical care. He purchased a house large enough for Margaret, David, and Tommy to live together comfortably, ensuring that the woman who had never owned property would finally have a stable home. He established medical trusts to cover Margaret's cancer treatments and Tommy's ongoing care, removing the financial stress that had dominated their lives for years. "I don't need your money," Margaret protested when Billy presented her with the deed to the new house. "I've managed on my own for this long." "You've done more than manage," Billy replied. "You've performed miracles with limited resources. Imagine what you could accomplish with the tools you deserve." Margaret's cancer treatments became more aggressive and effective when cost was no longer a consideration. While doctors couldn't promise a cure, they could offer hope and time, precious months or years that would allow her to see Tommy grow up healthy and strong. 6 months after the bone marrow transplant, Margaret agreed to perform publicly for the first time in nearly 3 decades. Mount Sinai Hospital organized a Christmas concert to celebrate Tommy's recovery and launched the Elizabeth and Margaret Thompson Foundation, with Margaret as the featured soloist. Billy sat in the front row of the hospital auditorium, watching his aunt take the stage with the same quiet dignity she had maintained through decades of sacrifice. She wore a simple blue dress that David and Tommy had chosen for her, and she carried the same 1923 Guarneri del Gesù violin that had sparked their first encounter. When Margaret began to play, the audience fell into reverent silence. She performed the same lullaby that had broken Billy's heart at the charity auction, but this time the music carried joy instead of sorrow, hope instead of hidden grief. Tommy sat beside Billy, healthy and strong, clapping enthusiastically for the grandmother who had never stopped fighting for his future. After the concert, Billy joined Margaret and her family on stage for the foundation's dedication ceremony. When the hospital administrator asked him to say a few words about Margaret's impact on his life, Billy found himself overwhelmed with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium, "please join me in honoring my Aunt Margaret, the woman who taught me that the greatest wealth comes from loving others more than yourself." It was the first time he had publicly claimed their family relationship, the first time he had acknowledged the bond that Margaret had honored faithfully for 27 years. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she heard the words she had never dared hope to hear. The evening concluded with an impromptu performance featuring 3 generations of the Thompson-Richardson family. Margaret played violin while David accompanied on piano and Tommy sang the lullaby his grandmother had taught him. Billy stood beside them, his hand on Margaret's shoulder, finally understanding that true success was measured not by what you accumulated, but by the love you created and preserved. As the last notes faded and the audience erupted in applause, Billy looked at his aunt and nephew and realized he had found what he had been searching for his entire life, a family united not by obligation or expectation, but by the transformative power of unconditional love. Margaret Thompson's story reveals the profound truth that our greatest blessings often come from people we overlook or underestimate. For 27 years, she loved Billy from the shadows, sacrificing her career, health, and financial security to ensure his success. Her quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation demonstrated that true nobility comes not from wealth or status, but from service and unconditional love. Billy's transformation from arrogant billionaire to grateful nephew shows us that it's never too late to recognize the people who have shaped our lives. His decision to give away his fortune wasn't just about money, it was about understanding that the most valuable inheritance we can receive is the love of those who choose to invest in our welfare without expecting recognition. This story reminds us to look beyond uniforms, accents, and social positions to see the full humanity of every person we encounter. The server at your event, the janitor in your building, the woman cleaning your office each carries a story of dreams, sacrifices, and hidden depths that might astonish you. Margaret's decades of anonymous generosity challenge us to examine our own capacity for selfless love and service to others. Have you ever been misjudged or humiliated based on your appearance, job, or social status like Margaret was? How did it feel? And what did you wish people had known about your true story?